Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last but not least keynote of this wonderful conference. We can just start right now because I think you are in a hurry, and afterwards I'm going to tell you some more things about the workshop day tomorrow, etc. But now it's time for the keynote. This keynote deals about, let's say, new and quite interesting approach to building websites. It deals with the idea of serverless. Maybe you've heard about that. Of course, maybe we do. It's not necessary to do this old joke, haha, there's a server anyway. But it's the really, if we speak about serverless, we really speak about that the metaphor of a server is not there in the traditional sense anymore. It's different. Having said that, I'm really happy to welcome Philip Hawksworth. He is in a developer experience team at Netlify, and he really cares about exactly these technologies, which deals about with JavaScript, lots of web APIs. And I would say, give a hand to Phil.
Okay, let's see if we can get right into it, because oh dear, I've given myself an extra minute there. I robbed another minute somehow. I'm very cautious about talking too quickly, because I can go a bit quickly at times, but I also don't want to overrun, so I've invested in a watch with a timer, which annoyingly has got the wrong time on there, so now I'm thinking I've lost another 10 minutes. It's frightening, but I'm very conscious about time when doing these kind of talks, and these things are great. I've invested in a wireless charger, which hopefully you can just about see on there. This is great. I just kind of pop it onto my phone onto charge whenever I go to sleep. I'm all in on wireless chargers at the moment. My phone uses one of these. Actually, I use this one, so it kind of sits by my desk. I just pop it there. No need to worry about the wires as I'm kind of plugging into my wireless charging. But you probably noticed, if you look at this picture, this little thing. Something's not quite right there. And in fact, if I look at this image again for these wireless chargers, don't be fooled by the aggressive cropping of those pictures from Amazon. We know there's something going on just off to the outside of this. You can go down a rabbit hole, actually, if you start looking for wireless charger pictures on the web. I don't know what this is. I mean, this is a wireless charger so that you can have a dock that you plug in with a wire, so you have another wireless charger with a wire. Anyway, the point that I'm inelegantly making is that we all accept the term wireless. We have wireless routers. We don't quibble too much about it. But as you already heard a moment ago, serverless, I'm always nervous about talking about serverless, because someone will say, I think you'll find there's a server somewhere. And of course there is, absolutely. And this talk really thinks a little bit about, can we really take servers out of the equation when we're hosting sites? There's some buzzwords in here, I'm not going to lie. Yes, serverless is in here. Also this term JAMstack, which I'm always going on about, which I'll introduce you to a little bit along the way. You may not have encountered that before. But both of these things really, and particularly when I'm thinking about serverless, try and do something. They try and let you focus on the things that you care about when you're building for the web. And they really help you focus on the things that you have to care about, the things that matter to you. Kind of liberates you to focus on what matters. And in fact, I think Chris, just before lunch, I think he said this. He said, just write code when it comes to serverless. I love that. I love being able to focus on that and let the other stuff get out of the way, so we can build things in a way that differentiates what we're building from what other people are building. It's about the craft of the product we're making rather than keeping a server alive. So I used to work at agencies and worked on lots of kind of big projects with big clients and what have you. And the problem with doing big projects is that there's kind of constraints and there's complexity and there's infrastructure and there's just all of these kind of things that can complicate the process of designing, building a piece of software and getting it out into the world. I really like the fact that we can start to focus our efforts on what matters. Chris Coyer, in a talk that he gave at JAMstack conference just last week, he had this lovely slide where he's talking about development as being the spectrum, where with a traditional stack, we had to be doing all of these kind of server-sidey kind of things to do with the operating system and the database layer and all of those bits and pieces, where for those of us who are focusing more on front-end development and the technologies around that, there's not much of an overlap there. We've often been able, but might not have specialized to do those things. So I like to think about how the front-end developers in the world are starting to be able to do more and more of this spectrum without having to get too far into the server-side aspect. I love thinking about lines and boxes. I've done lots of work over the years doing technical architectures and trying to figure out how we satisfy the needs of a client. So I love doodling lines and boxes and trying to figure out what the flow of information is, what states we need, how we start to pull bits of infrastructure together to make things happen. I think about this in this kind of a simplified form very often, and we'll return to this model a little bit later on. My name's Phil Hawksworth. My pronouns are he, him. I work in the developer experience team at Netlify. It's likely we might not have time for questions. I'm very happy to take questions, but if you do have questions, just grab me in the corridors, chat to me. If you've got comments or questions, you can shout them at me. Actually, say them politely at me on Twitter. I love to chat, so if you think I'm making sense or no sense, you can absolutely talk to me on there if you can't grab me around and about the event. I also recently published a book about the JAMstack, modern development, web development on the JAMstack, which is available for free at that URL. All of these URLs will get tweeted out later on as well and shared as part of the deck, so don't worry if you're scribbling these down. I also have a handful of these to give away if anyone would like a piece of paper to keep in their house. This URL structure that you're seeing, find that at something or other, that'll come up from time to time, so the find that at part, well, you don't need to keep making a note of that. The slides for this are already available there at find that at servered, and in fact, if you just go to find that at, you'll see a blog post about how I made that URL shortener using some of the technologies we're going to talk about today. It gets very meta very quickly, I'm afraid. But what are we talking about? Well, this title, I don't know if anyone has come across this before. Are you being served? Has anyone come across this? A show of hands? So sorry. So sorry for those of you who have. For those of you who haven't, you learn everything you need to know from this poster. This was a TV show in the UK in the 70s, which was very dated and pretty awful, and as a result became very niche and very popular in other countries, it seemed. When I was looking for this, I discovered that you could actually get this on DVD, which is terrifying. I thought it had vanished in the 70s. In fact, there's even a movie made about it. Again, all I can say is, on behalf of the people of Britain, I apologize for that. But there it is. I would not want to shy away from using it as a pun. But really, the thing that we're talking about here is serverless. And there's been conversation about serverless at this event already. What are we talking about when we're saying serverless? Well, for my purposes, I'm really talking about functions as a service. I like to think of it in those terms a little bit more. But also, I'm using it a little bit liberally to talk about serving websites without web servers. And I can see a few eyebrows being raised when I say that, but I would refer you to this diagram earlier on, where yes, there are web servers in the equation, but we as developers and as people hosting sites don't necessarily need to care about those servers, and that's what I'm very excited about. This is kind of a core attribute of this thing that I mentioned earlier on, the JAMstack. JAMstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. But really, what on earth is that for? What does it mean? Because many of us have been building on different types of web stacks for a long time, and there are, I think, officially a gazillion of them. So why do we really need another one? Well, let me just kind of unpack what it means in a little bit more detail. Yes, we know the acronym, but what does it actually mean? Shall I move forward instead of back? That will help us. There we go. So JAMstack, a bit more defined. It's a modern architecture to create fast and secure sites and dynamic apps with JavaScript, APIs, and pre-rendered markup served without web servers. So there's a couple of pieces there that are critical. It's served without web servers, but also pre-rendered markup. Now, this isn't necessarily a brand new idea. This term bake, don't fry was popularized by Aaron Swartz a long time ago when he was talking about his own blog and talking about generating the site ahead of time, like baking it in advance rather than frying it on demand for every request. And he went on to say, I care about not having to maintain cranky AOL server, Postgres, and Oracle installs. This is on his blog back in 2002, and I'm still right there with him. Now, this isn't, as I say, a new idea. 2002, that's a while ago. But the things that have changed, I think, are the tools and the ecosystem around this. So pre-generating static assets and getting them out into the world has never been easier. and it's never been more powerful. And I want to try and explain some of that as I go along today. So I've said a static site a couple of times. What can a static site even be? Well, there are lots of obvious contenders for that. Things like documentation sites, like React.js is a static site. Yarn is, and all of the site there is a static site. Vue.js, all of these things, these are all kind of statically pre-generated site. This site for Nike, built by an agency in Toronto, this is a statically generated site as well. So big companies are getting into this as well. It's not just for simple sites. But you might ask, well, can we make something which is actually a little bit more dynamic? I don't know if many people have come across Smashing Magazine. Maybe people in the room come across Smashing Magazine? Quite a few of you. So Smashing Magazine used to be a WordPress site. It's effectively a large publishing platform, really. And so this is now a pre-generated static, quote-unquote, static site, hosted directly from a CDN. But it also has interactive elements. It's got e-commerce, it's got membership areas, it's got job boards. All of these things are done using some crafty technologies in the browser and also pre-generating the site ahead of time. Another example of a pre-generated static site, we're getting into application territory. So people might have come across Squoosh, which was a site built, or a web application built by the Chrome advocate team. Really showing the things that you can do in the browser. This is an image optimization application, which I actually use as part of my day-to-day life now. This is served as a static site. It can also be served and saved offline so that you can use it locally, as many good web apps do. So things are starting to kind of reach from what we might have traditionally thought as static sites through to something which is much more functional, maybe more dynamic. If I might be a bit of a narcissist for a minute and show you what my own blog, this is just a blog. There's nothing too exciting about this. We've all seen a blog before. There's that article about the URL shortener. There are lots of articles on there. There's things like an inline search, which can get you to other things, like an article about the inline search. I told you it was going to get very meta. But this isn't necessarily particularly dynamic, except it also has my recent tweets on there, and it has my recent Instagram photos on there. Now, there are ways we can do that. We can drop blobs of JavaScript into the site to do that. But actually, all of these things are pre-generated and rendered right into the page, into the site. And they do that through some integrations. So this is the behind the scenes of my site. I host it. I work at Netlify, and I host it on Netlify, as you might imagine. And one of the things that I can do there is that I can create these things called build hooks. So these are just HTTP endpoints that if I ever post to them, it will rebuild the site again. One of the aspects of my site is that it pulls content in from different APIs at build time, such as the Twitter API. So whenever it builds, it gets the latest tweets and it builds it in. So what I have is I have a build hook here set up for, I've called it Twitter Activity Trigger, and it just creates an endpoint for me. And what I do is I use if this then that, which is a service on the web that's free for monitoring different APIs and then triggering different events off that. And I fire that event hook every time I tweet. So it always has the latest content from a moment or two ago. The people who are paying attention in the room will also notice this little trigger at the bottom, the Alexa voice command webhook, because I like to stand at home and say deploy hawksworth.com. The arms are critical. It doesn't work unless you put your hands in the air. So you can add as many of these things as you like and start to make something that's static and pre-generated feel a lot more dynamic. So I've been talking about this kind of thing and writing examples and what have you for a little while now. And a while ago, this happened. I got a bit cocky, and I was shouting about it on the web, and some people on the internet noticed, which is terrifying, of course. And one of the things that was sent to me was this. The excellent Zach Leatherman, who you might know from the web for his work on web font performance and his static site generator 11t. He wrote this. He wrote a tweet, I think deliberately trying to goad me, saying, free side project idea, an HTML-only static site generated clock that deploys a new version to Netlify every minute, which is ridiculous. So I thought about this for a moment on a kind of dark evening back at home, and then I responded with this. Because why would I not rise up to that kind of challenge? And I thought about it a little bit longer, and actually when I was looking at it, I said to Zach, only an idiot would make what you were suggesting. here it is. So if any of you want to know what the time is, you can go to setyourwatchby.netlify.com, or you can go to find that at time, and what you'll find there is, hopefully, the time. And it has time is different in different places in the world. So if you to go to it from here, you should have the correct time for here rather than the time from wherever the server ran. But all that's happening here is at build time, I'm taking the server time and putting it onto a page, and that's it. And I localize that into the different time zones. And then one of the things that we can do at Netlify is on the CDN, we can shape your traffic to go to the correct endpoint depending on your locale. So if you look at that here, you should see the correct time within a few seconds. There are URLs for each different city or locale. And I update this by using something called webtask.io. Now, webtask.io is something that will let you run serverless functions with a cron tab. So I've created myself a webhook in that site, just the same as my Twitter hook, and I call that every minute of every day forever. Since I did this, actually this is a few weeks old, this screen grab, but it's deployed the site 513,901 times since I deployed it, and it keeps on rolling. And the infrastructure team at Netlify love me for it. Now, don't do this. This is silly. It works beautifully, and it's a pre-generated static asset that happens to look at. Is anyone checking the time, by the way? Yeah, I knew some of you would. I got a request to see if we could make it into an app for an iWatch, which I just loved, but it's the most over-engineered clock in the world. And of course, this is crazy. Redeploying your site every minute of every day is not the right thing to do. But I'm trying to illustrate a point here, a couple of points. One is that there's very low friction to deployment these days. That's what I'm talking about when I say the tooling and the ecosystem has changed when it comes to static hosting. And also, the other point is that when you've got events and automation, you can start to glue things together to do all kinds of interesting things. So, there's a couple of principles I want to talk about here. One of them is pre-rendering, which I've mentioned a little already, and the other is serverless rendering. But before we do that, move to serverless rendering, let's talk about pre-rendering and why you would do that. So there's some motives for doing pre-rendering. I like to think of this as doing the work now so your servers don't have to do it later on. And the other thing I like to think about is putting distance between the complexity and your user that's coming to view the site. I like the complexity to happen on my terms, not at request time. If the complexity happens in my build, whether that's on my development machine or in some continuous integration server, I'm way happier than if it's happening per every request that comes in. So let's talk about requests for a second, and let's look at a traditional stack versus a JAMstack or pre-rendered stack, just for the sake of illustration. So a traditional stack, a request flow might look a little like this. We might have a web browser making a request for a view of a site, and that'll hit some infrastructure. Maybe it goes to a CDN. Realistically, it's probably going to some hosting infrastructure that we manage. Maybe there's a load balancer, which is determining which web server might honor that request. That web server might have some templates on it, but it might need to get some data, which it gets from a database server, and it figures out which one it's going to do for that. The database returns the data. The web server compiles that view into a view that can pass back through the load balancer, maybe drop some things off at a CDN, and eventually return a view to the eyeballs of the user. Now, with the JAMstack approach, it's a little different. Same scenario, we make a request for a view of a page, and that page exists at the CDN. It was put there at deploy time, so we return that view to the user, and we're done. Now, I know this is an oversimplification. I know this isn't exactly how every web architecture works, but to illustrate the point, I want to kind of just show these two as a comparison. Because if we can live in this kind of world, then we have a very different profile for things like security, performance, and scale. I'll talk about that in a second. The complexity happens at build and deployment time. This isn't happening per request. This is happening on our terms. When we run a build that might be running some kind of static site generator, some build script, that ends up being pushed to the CDN when we do that deployment, when we do that build. And then we get this lovely decoupling between request time and build time, which is a really powerful thing. So this brings us a few advantages. I mentioned security, performance, and scale. Let's look at those in just a tiny bit more detail before we move on. So we're going to look at this diagram a few times. In terms of security, we've got a greatly reduced surface area for attack here. I mean, there is no server more secure than the one that doesn't exist. So if we take things out of our architecture, there are fewer things for us to protect. Here, there are lots of places where a request could go, where bad actors could take some kind of action, and the fewer of those that exist, the easier it is for us to secure, and the easier it is for us to reason about that security. So that's the first thing. Far fewer moving parts to attack. When it comes to performance, well, a traditional stack actually does something that's a little unusual. It actually starts to add static layers in order to improve performance. And I'm talking about caching. So again, our trusty diagram here, if we're going to start to introduce caching here to improve performance, we might add caching layers at the web server, might cache common requests to the database, we might cache common responses at the load balancer. The CDN is a big cache. So there's lots of caching that we could potentially add here. But the key is that on the bottom, everything is in a cache. There's no figuring out what's in the cache and what's not and how to refresh the cache. Deploying refreshes the cache, and that's the end of it. In the top scenario, we've got to understand the logic of what's cached and what's not and manage that. Okay, how about scale? And by that, I'm talking about handling kind of traffic loads. Well, traditional stacks often add infrastructure in order to scale. Again, back to our trusty diagram. Caching has already helped us out a little bit when it comes to dealing with scale. But if anyone's had to design and price infrastructure for a project and say how much something's going to cost, you'll often have the question, well, how much traffic are we going to get? And how do we start to add infrastructure to scale? We might start adding more web servers to our infrastructure or database servers, maybe even more load balancers. It's a difficult problem because every piece of the puzzle here has to receive code whenever we deploy, and it has to be part of the chain when we're making requests to it. So I love this notion that with the JAMstack architecture, we can start decoupling. We can start taking that complexity out of the way and start doing the complex things at build time without the need for worrying about scale. Deploying now gets to be a process of getting things to the CDN as effectively as we can. The lovely thing is that there are lots of companies working on that. Netlify is one where I work, but there are loads of others. We've already heard talks from Microsoft today. There's all kinds of companies working on this and trying to make tooling as easy as possible to get things to the CDN and to host things for you. So it's kind of an interesting space to work in. Okay, let's flick over. I'm trying to go quickly. Let's flick over to renderless serverless rendering. Cool. And look at that. Okay, so serverless rendering, is that part of JAMstack? Well, we did say in this definition that JAMstack is serving things without web servers, so that sounds very much like it might be. And there's often cases where we can't just pre-render everything. Sometimes we need some logic to execute at request time. And so sometimes you just need a little bit of logic somewhere on a server, and that's when serverless functions can come to the rescue. They can perform things without us having to provision an entire server and then maintain that. Now, it's tempting to just recreate everything in serverless functions that we had in our traditional stack, but I'd just urge a little bit of caution about that. I think, yes, that can free us up from managing the infrastructure, but that doesn't free us up from having to reason about all of the dynamic things that could happen at request time. And so I'd urge a tiny bit of caution about that. I prefer to think about augmentation or enhancement, which kind of marries nicely with the idea of progressive enhancement. Marcus Schork, who works as a technical architect at Unilever, talks about static first, which I really, really like. I want to try and illustrate this with a bit of an example, if I possibly can, so I can flesh out exactly what I'm talking about. So I made a little thing, and it's something that I think the world needed. And here it is. It's virtual lollipop. Now, this didn't translate at all well in America. They didn't really understand lollipop. Popsicle is what I was told to call it. But here we're going to call it virtual lollipop. The reason I built this is that it's something that allows us to use user-generated content. Now, user-generated content feels like a ceiling that's hard to break through when it comes to static or JAMstack pre-generated sites. So the virtual lollipop, what you can do is you can go and you can make your own lollipop. You can put in a little message, and as a result of that, you get something on a URL which you can send to a friend and make them happy. It's user-generated content all the way. And so, this ends up with a URL that you can go and you can retrieve, and it's static and it's pre-generated and all the rest of the good stuff. So that's what we're going to look at in just a second. Now, I gave myself some requirements for this, and the requirements were, I wanted pre-generated pages with real URLs, even for the pages with user-generated content in them. I wanted data stored in a database because that seemed like a logical thing. We're creating lots of content, so we needed a database to store that in. But I didn't want to become a DBA. I don't want to have to manage a database myself. And I wanted instant access to the new content. So when a new piece of user-generated content gets created, I wanted instant access to that without having to wait for the site to rebuild and regenerate. So with those as my kind of requirements, I set about thinking about the tools. And the tools for this were, well, I used a static site generator to generate all the pages. I used 11t. Could have been anything, to be quite frank. The database, I used a database as a service called FaunaDB. Again, it could have been any database provider that gives me an API. And then for instant access to the content, I used serverless functions. I used Netlify functions. Again, it could have been anything. It could have been something that we'd heard about from Azure earlier on. There are lots of people creating these kind of toolings. These happen to be the pieces that I chose. And then I started thinking about how I do this. So I drew some lines and boxes, which you can't read and you can't see, but I'm going to walk you through it anyway. So every lolly page is a pre-generated page. So a request for a lolly page goes off to get that from a URL. Fine. So in order to generate all of those pages, I had to hit a database at generation time. And this is what the code for that looks like. Now, I think it's probably a bit hard to read, but don't worry. All I want to do is illustrate that we authenticate with the database. We query for the lollies and their data via an API that gives us a promise. We resolve the promise of lollies when that's returned, and then we catch any errors. So again, I don't expect you to read all of this. I just wanted to show you that it's like this much code, and I wanted a slide that said, resolve the promise of lollies, because that just makes me incredibly happy. OK, so that's our generating all of these pages. How about the UI for creating a new one? Well, that's on another pre-generated page. It's a page with a form that's served statically. So whenever we want to make a new lolly, that's the page that we hit. And when we submit that form, there's no server at the back end. So what we submit to is a serverless function, which is going to then put that content into the database, creating a URL that will return to the user and send them off to get that new page at that new URL. The problem here, of course, is that at that point, there is no new page. The data exists only in a database, so they're going to hit a 404. But we can do something about that thanks to triggers and automation. So at the point that we save a new lolly, we also use one of these things that we're starting to become familiar with. We have a build hook here, which says new lolly in the freezer. That's what I've called it. And that happens, that is fired in this function, in the save data function. As soon as we've pushed data to the database, that's what we do. So let's look at that code as well. Again, you can't read all of this. Not to worry, that's all of the code. We're authenticating with the database. We're posting the data that we've got from the form to the database API. As soon as we've got a good, a successful response from that, we fire our webhook to rebuild the site. And then we send the user off to check the freezer for a lolly, which is a ridiculous thing, again, to have in a slide. Check the freezer, what does that mean? Well, you might be ahead of me already. So to check checking for a pre-generated URL for a lolly page, because now the build is running and it's going to publish that there. And if it's found, we'll return a 200 and we'll just serve the static page. That's great. But if it's not found, what we'll do is we'll 404. And we can choose what we do with that 404. In this case, the 404 is actually served by a serverless function that does a serverless render. Because the content doesn't exist here in pre-generated pages, but it does exist here in the database. So what we can do is we 404 with this serverless function that looks like this. It's something that goes and pulls in a JavaScript template literal, which is the page, the HTML page with some variables in it. We authenticate with the database again. We go and get the lolly from the lolly data from the database API. Then we mash the template together with the data that we've got and serve that back to the user with an HTTP response. And if there's nothing there, if we don't find an entry in the database for that, then we send the user to a fallback page, which would be like a 404. This is my proudest moment of this entire site. This is my 404 page. My boss is Sarah Drasner, so I made this with SVG, and I put a joke on there just because I was desperately I just want to win favor with Sarah, I'll be honest. So I think we should jump into a quick demo of that, because what makes the palms get sweatier more than a quick demo at a conference? Oh, hang on. I can do this. Can I do this? Let's make it so that you can see. Can you see my? Yes, we can see this. Okay, so so this is the kind of Netlify backend for this site, and we'll look at that in a second. But for the moment, it's time. Let me see if I can make you see this. It's time to create a new lolly. Germany, your sausages. Oh dear. And beer. Oh, lovely. Oh, man. Hooray. Okay, this is the most important part of the of this whole process. Let's yes. I don't know what these flavors are, but that's pretty close. From your friend Phil. Okay. So I've posted that now to the database. Now you'll see straight away that I've gone to a URL that appears to show that back to me. This is actually the URL I want to share with people. And if I hit that, oh, you can see I got redirected because it's 404 because that doesn't exist yet. So I'm still seeing a view of that data, but it's being served by my serverless function. If I go back over here, and let's go and look at the deploys, we can see we've got a deploy which is running, and it's a deploy that's been triggered by the hook new lolly in the freezer. Let's go and have a look at that. Or in fact, I might have, there's a lot of lollies in here. Hang on. A lot of pages being generated. Jeez, okay. Wow, people like their lollipops. Okay, the site, sorry, I actually missed it. The site is already live. It took about 39 seconds to run that. So let's try this again. Let's copy that and let's go to that URL. Oh dear, there we go. Okay, great. So now it's not redirecting. Now it's been served by a static asset that's been generated because my site automatically redeployed. Okay, that was the fastest live demo ever. Okay, so I've written that up in a lot more detail in this article on CSS tricks that you can take a look at. But I just wanted to recap just a tiny bit on some of the things that make that possible. Because there are all kinds of enablers that make this kind of thing possible, and we can use for all kinds of different purposes. One of them is custom 404 routing. It used to be that it was difficult to manage that, but with the kind of modern tooling we have, and lots of services have this, we can route 404s differently depending on where they happen. So this is an extract from my TOML file, which is like the configuration file for my site. And that specifies one of my redirects. So this redirect rule is anything within the path of lolly, a wildcard, if something there is 404'd and doesn't match, what we'll do is we'll return a status of 302 and we'll redirect someone to this serverless function. So that's the kind of longhand route for my serverless function. And I'll pass the identifier from the URL across to that so that we can look that up. And that's all that is. So that we've got custom 404 routing. Now, another 404 route will happen if it's a real 404 where other parts of the site aren't responding or don't have any pages to render that. But we can segment 404 routing anywhere we like across any of our sites. The other thing that I'd call out are events and triggers and automation. I've kind of talked about this along the way. But these things, when stitched together, are incredible. They can let us do all kinds of amazing things. Our kind of imagination is our limit there. Thanks. Also, databases as a service. I mentioned FaunaDB, but there are so many out there now, and they're becoming more prolific all the time. Being able to access a database as a service and access it via an API is a wonderful thing for a software engineer. We don't have to have the deep technical knowledge about how to scale and provision and maintain and secure databases. We just need to know our ways around the APIs. So you can find the kind of API and the kind of database which suits your needs, and then you can consume it in this way. Functions as a service allow us to do all kinds of things and unlock all kinds of capabilities without having to provision and maintain an entire server. Now, these aren't perfect for every single scenario, but it's incredible how much we can do with them if we start to layer them on in this kind of a way. These two approaches, kind of pre-rendering, and I advocate pre-rendering as much as humanly possible, and then falling back to serverless rendering. These things can, again, be applied to do all kinds of wonderful things. And I think I'm seeing a bit of a shift, and I'd advocate for this shift. It used to be when I was trying to design a technical architecture, I would use a traditional, often monolithic back-end approach, and I'd try and find places where, for performance reasons, I'd add caching layers and opportunities to make things static and abstract them out of the way, but still have something which was dynamic at the back end. I like to flip that now. Instead, I like to think of things as static first. So I like to approach something and say, everything is going to be pre-rendered unless it absolutely can't be. And in that way, you end up being able to benefit from all of these other attributes of the JAMstack to do with scale, to do with security, to do with performance, and many others that I haven't had time to mention today. So it's incredible how far you can go if you start with this approach and then start to layer on the simplest bits of being dynamic on top of it, because then we can become much closer to the stack at the bottom where things happen at build time and automated away from request time, and really simplify the stack. Kind of like to finish off just by saying that simplifying is not dumbing down. I think for a long time I've been talking about this kind of architecture and trying to simplify. And lots of the big brands that I spoke to a while ago, they would kind of turn their nose up at it and say, we need something more complex than that because we're big thundering brand X. But simplifying is not dumbing down. Simplifying lets us focus on what really is important so we can do a much better job with higher confidence. This kind of simplified architecture is way easier to reason about. We heard about that in some of the other talks throughout the conference, where reducing the kind of footprint of some of these tools and bits of infrastructure lets us reason about them so much more easily. So with that, I think I'm just about out of time. So thank you for listening. My question really is, with all those things, what should we make? I need to go off now and find somewhere to plug in my wireless charger. And also, I mentioned there's a bunch of links in here. I won't go through these all now. There are a ton of links of things that I've mentioned and resources you might find useful. The last thing I'd mention is that there is a kind of community Slack for this, where people who are building tools and building resources are talking about these things, and meetups popping up. You'd be very welcome to join us in there, jamstack.org/Slack. All of these resources and links are here in the slides. Find that at Servered. Please ask me questions around the conference, or you can hit me up on Twitter. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
I think it's probably safe to say that open source won the battle of how software is developed.
Und was wir jetzt tun müssen eigentlich als IT ist, wir müssen es schaffen, nicht unsere eigenen Prozesse zu optimieren, sondern wir müssen die wahrgenommene Geschwindigkeit optimieren.